It is my pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion on the U.S.-Mexico border. As we all unfortunately know, this is a topic that has come to the fore of public discussion during the ongoing presidential campaign. And as we also know, more than a discussion of the topic, we've had vituperation and othering of those with the least legal protection. Given this context, we are fortunate to have among our panelists two panelists who bring the insights of the visual arts and literature to this topic. First, we're going to hear from Nadiah Rivera Fellah, who is a Ph.D. candidate in art history at the Graduate Center at CUNY. Her research focuses on Latin American art, and her dissertation examines photography of the U.S.-Mexico border in the 1970s and 1980s. Nadiah was formerly a Mellon Curatorial Fellow at the Newark Museum and the James Gallery, and before her doctoral studies, she worked as a curatorial assistant at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art and the Allen Memorial Art Museum in Oberlin, Ohio. She holds a BA from Oberlin College and has written frequently for the New American Painting and the Scene Journal. So, without more ado, let's welcome Nadiah.
Thank you, Juan, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to the Bildner Center to share some of my research with you all on photography and the border, this very timely subject. And this seemed kind of like an appropriate image to start with, considering that today is Halloween. The Mexican photographer Eniac Martinez took this photograph in 1989. It documents a family of Mixtecos, indigenous migrants from southern Mexico, celebrating Halloween in Gilroy, California. In the photograph, a young boy is dressed in a Dracula or vampire costume and looks directly at the viewer. His face is painted white, with black paint connecting his eyebrows across his forehead. Although the photograph is black and white, we can tell that red paint, meant to simulate blood, punctuate his cheeks and edges of his mouth. The boy has wrapped a cape around himself, and in the raking light, we can see creases in the inexpensive costume material, perhaps traces of its recent removal from the store's packaging. The bottom edge of the photograph ends right below the cape, cutting off the boy's feet and giving the impression that he is floating. Behind the boy are two figures and two dogs. Beyond that, the horizon line of an impending dusk slices through the center of the image, and we can see glimmers of light in the darkening background. The yard that the family stands in is mostly dirt and gravel. A small wooden platform and railing to the boy's right indicate the steps to a home, perhaps the simple structure of farm worker housing in Gilroy, which is known for its garlic crop. The overall impression of the photograph is a striking one. Although the young boy's family is focused on playing with their dogs, and therefore appear blurred or distorted in their motion, the boy's frontal pose and sharply outlined image is offset by the cloudy, darkening sky, and his gaze confronts viewers in an assertive and almost challenging manner. The photographer, Eniac Martinez, began this series in 1987. A young photographer at the time, in his late 20s, Martinez has spoken about the difficulties of gaining the trust of his subject's close-knit community. However, he persisted and spent a period of 4 years following a group of indigenous migrants, a group called the Mixtecos, from their native state of Oaxaca in the south of Mexico to various locations throughout California, where the families worked as seasonal farm workers or day laborers. Each winter, the families would return to Oaxaca, and Martinez would follow them as they journeyed back home, bringing goods, money, and cultural influences from El Norte. This cyclical migration route is a common one among indigenous migrants, and Martinez thematized the cyclical pattern in his 1994 publication documenting this series, titled Mixtecos Norte-Sur. In fact, Martinez's series suggests that the Mixteco community's survival, both economically and culturally, is based on migration. Rural states in Mexico with large indigenous populations struggled with increasing levels of poverty since the country's economy industrialized and centralized throughout the mid-20th century. In the 1950s and 60s, this resulted in huge amounts of migration from the provinces into Mexico City, as well as northward into the United States. In fact, laborers from Mexico filled labor shortages during World War II in the United States under the Bracero program, an agreement between the US and Mexico that lasted from 1942 to 64. However, against the cultural and social assimilation that often followed these earlier waves of migration, Martinez's photographs imply that cyclical migration keeps social ties among the Mixtecos strong, and that these ties expand the confines of national boundaries. They are kept alive not only through repeated contact, but also through the annual festivals and celebrations that he documents. We see these in images that document the popular Festival of San Juan, and in this particular case, what we may read as an Americanized version or stand-in for Dia de los Muertos. The series is thus a documentary narrative of survival and resistance among Mixteco migrants. The resistance of migrants to oppressive border security and racist policing practices is widespread in documentary photographs of the border in the 1980s in particular. It was then that immigration policies underwent extremely conservative reforms during Reagan's presidencies and then following under the Bush presidency that began in 88 and went to 92. Part of the debate was fueled by the news media, which pushed the hysteria of a so-called invasion of illegal aliens to the perceived levels of a national crisis. This escalating rhetoric, used by both politicians and the media, culminated around the 1986 passage of the Immigration Reform and Control Act, or IRCA, which had an immediate and significant impact on border enforcement resources and practices on the US-Mexico border. The 80s were also a time when illegal drug trafficking was a growing concern, and the ensuing war on drugs identified trafficking threats along the border in particular. It was a predominant concern with enforcing the newly passed IRCA that accounts for an enormous surge in artistic, activist, and intellectual attention given to the border in the 1980s. In the area of documentary photography, Nadiah Martinez is just one of dozens of photographers that began to document the site of the border, its inhabitants, its urban spaces, and its material environments at this moment. In fact, a range of artists from both Mexico and the United States began to document the border, and their artistic practices ranged from photojournalistic backgrounds to fine art and conceptual backgrounds. On the former end, Susan Meiselas is a New York-based photographer who has belonged to the Magnum Photo Agency since 1976 and did a series on the border in 1989. Meiselas had recently gained acclaim for her series documenting the Nicaraguan Revolution in 1978 and 79. She was deeply aware of the US-sponsored interventions in Central America and how they paradoxically produced refugees who came into the US through our border with Mexico. In 1989, Meiselas spent several weeks on the border following border patrolmen around the clock as they conducted their duties. In one photograph from the series, Meiselas captures the moment when, at 2 a.m., a 12-year-old boy is apprehended by the Border Patrol. The boy is taken to a detention center in San Diego, where he is fingerprinted, photographed, and processed as an illegal minor. Within the space of this photograph, we see two figures in a stark, brightly lit room. The only items that interrupt the painted cinder black walls of the room are printed mugshots, presumably of other undocumented migrants. The history of categorizing and archiving the criminal body as a bureaucratic tool of social control comes to mind, a history that was critically raised around this time, notably in the 1986 essay by Alan Sekula titled The Body in the Archive. Meiselas' image also functions as a kind of meta-image of the relationship between photographer and subject, and makes explicit the symbolic power relations between them. This is a relationship Meiselas would have been significantly attuned to, and one raised only a few years earlier by Susan Sontag's seminal book On Photography, which theorized the inherently violent act of photographing others. Meiselas asks viewers to acknowledge this power dynamic, one emphasized in this image by the youth and innocence of the boy cast as criminal, as well as their own implications in the stated dynamic. The lines of the room's walls appear distorted due to the wide angle of the panoramic Hasselblad camera she used for this series, a surreal effect that adds to the strangeness of the documented encounter. While assuming culpability for her role as photographer, Mycelis mitigates this aspect in other ways. For instance, true to her typical practice, Mycelis spent hours engaging in candid interviews with migrants, patrolmen, and border residents, incorporating their quotes into each iteration of the series' publication and exhibition. And the quote on the right is quite long, but it's by a border patrolman, and he's kind of describing this call that comes into them from this woman who's complaining about an undocumented migrant living on her land. And so the border patrol has to go and kind of follow up, and they ask this man, "Where are you from? Do you have papers?" And they say, "Yes." He said, "Yes." He showed us an I-94 that he was out under bond. So we asked him how he got out on bond, and he pointed up the hill to the lady who called us, who wanted him out. He said, "She took me to immigration and tried to get my papers, so I'm waiting for them." So we went back up there and we asked, "Is this true?" And she goes, "Well, yeah, but I don't need him anymore. He's working for those people over there. So I don't want him to get papers. I want you to get rid of him because he's not working for me. It's like going to the Home Depot and buying a bag of fertilizer. Well, I'm done with him, so you get rid of him. They want these guys' sweat and they want their labor, but they don't want them as neighbors." End quote. Also characteristic of Mycelis' practice is the thorough background research she does before and while photographing a series, an aspect seen in the extensive amount of articles, press releases, related case law, and ephemera the artist saved in her archives. At the time she was photographing her border series in 1989, implementation of the 1986 IRCA was at the forefront of the Border Patrol's mission. Interestingly enough, their implementation was accompanied by an effort to enhance the public image of Border Patrolmen, an aspect that can be seen in this brochure released by the INS around 1986. What is interesting about this brochure is that although it's drawn in a cartoon form, almost looking like it's for a child, it is a fairly accurate illustration of the broadening tactical enforcement measures the INS was implementing. We know that throughout the 1970s and 80s, helicopters and small fixed-wing aircraft were purchased for the Border Patrol. You can see that kind of like on the inside here. They were expanding their detention centers and enhancing their surveillance techniques. And they were also given high-powered rifles and authorized to use deadly force against migrants, an aspect that was meant to aid in their new drug enforcement duties. And we also know that in 1984, the Border Patrol reintroduced horse patrols in the southern region, mostly in an effort to enhance their public image and appear as, quote, ambassadors of goodwill. It's ironic. And in fact, there are several pictures in this brochure of patrolmen on horseback, 4 on the cover alone. You see here, there's like very much an emphasis on the patrolmen on horseback. Although for all of the photographs I've looked documenting the border at this period, I haven't seen any of patrolmen on horseback, which probably proves this is a little more tied to fiction than actual reality. I emphasize the enforcement tactics of the border in order to underscore its material reality and the qualities that make it a potent contact zone and thus a powerful shaper of identities and subjectivities among migrants in particular. Features of the material realities of the border are widespread in documentary photographs from this period. I say this to argue against a trend in scholarship from the 1980s onward that utilizes a post-national framework and conceptualization scholarship. Much of this scholarship draws from theorists like Walter Mignolo and his concept of border thinking, and the border as a porous and fluid cultural terrain. This idea follows the rise of globalization, and in the period leading up to NAFTA in 1994, argues that borders are disintegrating and nation-states weakening, allowing for the free movement of goods, capital, and labor. Against this line of reasoning, and drawing from the documentary images of this period, I find it quite difficult to assign a post-national framework to representations of the US-Mexico border and the way in which migrants experience its terrain. This is an aspect that has only become more pronounced since the 1980s and indeed threatens to become still worse in our future. The last photographer I will speak about is Luis Carlos Bernal, an Arizona native who was best known for his intimate portraits of migrants in domestic interiors. A resident of Tucson, Arizona, where he taught photography at Pima Community College, Bernal, who passed away in 1993, began shooting these home interiors in the 1970s and throughout the 80s. He also began shooting in color at a very early moment when many others criticized the medium for looking too commercial. However, in 1978, a review of an exhibition at the Oberlin Museum in which the photograph on the left was shown, titled Dos Mujeres, fellow photographer and critic Hal Fisher praised the potency of Bernal's photographs, which he attributed to creating a tangible aura and sensuality with his use of color. Indeed, his photographs are a complete departure from the scenes of conflict in Mycelis's series. They display a serene calmness and a sense of comfort at being in the inside the private spaces of families. In artist statements and articles from the period, Bernal describes his documentary approach as sociocultural and says he always spends time getting to know his subjects before he photographs them, an aspect captured in the intimate and vulnerable expressions of the women pictured here. His practice was also structured around a politics of self-representation among Mexican Americans, an aspect that Bernal drew from his participation in the Chicano movement in the 1960s. In the text for a 1983 exhibition of his photographs titled U.S.-Mexico Interface, Bernal writes of his consciousness being awakened by the Chicano civil rights movement and his own identification with the politics. He writes, quote, "Chicanismo represents a new sense of pride, a new attitude, and a new awareness. The Chicano artist cannot isolate himself from the community, but finds himself in the midst of the religious and family ties that we have experienced as Chicanos," end quote. This statement could be applied to images like the one on the right of a woman in Lubbock, Texas, a small town that Bernal visited in 1987, north of the U.S.-Mexico border. In it, a woman stands with hands clasped in front of a small home altar. The wooden shape of the altar mimics the architecture of a simple church, with a pointed roof and cross at its apex. Inside are an arrangement of objects, including votive candles and a likeness of the Virgin. On the wall to the woman's left is a carved wooden image of the Last Supper. Its figure is just barely legible in the photograph. The blue walls and altar impart a calm, serene atmosphere to the image, and the location of the objects in a corner of the home emphasize the privacy of the space, as does the woman's protective stance before them. Documenting familial spaces along the border was also a photographic project with conceptual roots at the time. Not only did traditional family structures take on different meanings when families were dispersed, but given common histories of displacement among migrants and Chicanos, it represented an opportunity to reimagine alternative social spaces not tied to national boundaries, an element that makes the series similar to Martinez's on the Mixtecos as well. In addition, Bernal is not the only photographer whose artistic practice is informed by his radical politics. In fact, what is most particular about the generation of photographers that was documenting the border at this moment is the way they were trained as artists in the 60s and 70s in Mexico and the United States, when photographic culture itself was experiencing a monumental change. Many of the artists were informed by or participants in social movements of the 1960s taking place in both Mexico and the US. But what's more, the very way in which these photographers learned to photograph was changed in very way. In Mexico, Eniac Martinez was a member of the Council of Mexican Photography, or the CMF, which was founded in 1978 under a radical legacy of collectivity, as well as socially and politically engaged photographic practices. In the US, Susan Mycelis drew on her background as an anthropology student for her socially engaged documentary practice, which incorporated narrative strategies like interviews and extensive research to supplement the images themselves. Her membership in Magnum is also a notable aspect of her background, as Magnum is a cooperative photo agency founded in the wake of World War II by photographers like Henry Cartier-Bresson and Robert Capa, and others committed to documenting social unrest and inequality around the globe. And Bernal, a close friend of many of the Mexican photographers who founded the CMF, instrumental in founding its sister organization in the United States, known as the Council of Latino Photography. Through these associations, we know that many of the photographers documenting the border in the 1980s were aware of one another's work and supported one another's unorthodox methods of socially engaged photographic practice. Thus, at the same moment that the border as a physical landscape was transforming, so was photographic culture, and documentary practice in particular. The convergence of these two moments in history is quite a remarkable one, and the images of the border from this period are extraordinary documents that attest to both of these transformations, that of border culture and photographic culture. I will end with a photograph by Eniac Martinez from his Mixteco series. It is taken from the interior of a church's clock tower and shows three inverted clock faces. If you remember, his series documented the cyclical migration of the Mixtecos and their journey from south to the north and back to the south. In the introduction to Martinez's publication, author Eduardo Martin reasons that the three clocks represent the three different temporalities of the Mixtecos: those that have not yet left the Campo, those that have emigrated to the north, and those that have returned home. The temporal unevenness that migrants experience can be applied to instances beyond those of the Mixtecos. It can be seen in the instances of detention that undocumented migrants are subject to, the delays they experience in waiting for the legalization process to occur, the time investments they contribute for their undervalued labor, or the waiting for family members to join them. While these aspects ask us to consider factors beyond the spatial and material qualities of the border, they still represent a system that migrants are subject to, a system of power that migrants are subject to, another struggle that the border imparts on them. This chronological upset further plays a role in the unique identity formation in the borderlands. However, the act of documenting the struggles of the border can also be read as one of resistance, of an informed, politically and socially engaged photographic community operating in solidarity with communities of migrants. It is within this action of documenting undocumented, so to speak, that we find records of resistance and opportunities for empowerment. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia, for this wonderful presentation. Next, we're going to hear from David Lida. He's a novelist and writer who has lived in Mexico since 1990. He's the author of several books about Mexico, including Travel Advisory, a collection of short stories, and First Stop in the New World, a street-level panorama of contemporary Mexico City. In 2008, he began to work as a mitigation specialist, conducting investigations for lawyers in the US who defend Mexicans and other Latin Americans who are charged with capital murder and as such face death penalty. Through interviews with the clients, their family, friends, classmates, teachers, and doctors, Lida reconstructs the stories of their lives, looking for the mitigating circumstances, a tool for the defense lawyer to negotiate some better circumstances than death with prosecutor. This work is a point of departure for his new novel, Our Life, and David Lida will talk about his genesis in Mexico and read from his new novel.
Thank you for inviting me to speak on this panel. You can all hear me, right? I don't like talking into microphones if I don't have to. This is the second time that I've spoken at the Bildner Center, and it's an honor. And I'm particularly happy to be speaking at the same time as Nadia, who I think is doing a really important job of interpreting the documentation of the border. I was really impressed with your interpretation of the work. Just parenthetically, Eniac Martinez lives down the street from me in Mexico City.
He's great.
I've known him he's a great photographer, I've known him for many years. But, and also mostly I want to thank you for coming. I first went to Mexico when I was 23 years old. I went as a tourist to Oaxaca, and I spent a few days there, and I got on a very small airplane, and in 20 minutes, I was at a beach called Puerto Escondido. Some of you may know Puerto Escondido. In those days, it was described to me as una playa rústica, a rustic beach. That was an interesting word to me. I would have described it as unspoiled. Rustica meant that There were no high-rise hotels. There was nobody trying to sell you a timeshare in a condominium on the beach. There were no bungee jumps or those plastic bananas that go by in the water. It was, but it was a very lovely place. I remember eating fresh fish every day that had been caught that morning by fishermen. The hotel I stayed in was very nice, but it was ground level. There wasn't a second story. And of course, there was a contingent of foreign tourists, not many, and a lot of them were Europeans. I of course, remember the topless Italian women, because that was a scandal in Mexico. Mexican women, even to this day, seldom would do anything like that. One day in Puerto Escondido, it occurred to me to walk just 2 or 3 streets behind the beach into the town, the pueblo. And I was born and raised in New York City, so when I say streets, I have to say there were nothing like what I would have identified as streets in my experience before then. They were unpaved, and the houses of the residents who lived there were made of adobe, with laminated roofs made of plastic or tin. Some of them had no windows, or a hole cut out with a piece of plastic. Some of them had no doors, and to judge from the smell, many of them didn't have sewage. Now, I would have very much liked in that trip to have gone into one of those houses to talk to the people who live there. And this for me is the real meaning of the border between Mexico and the United States. In those days, I had no language with which I could share a conversation with the people who lived there. And I was pretty clueless on a socioeconomic level or a cultural level about what could possibly be going on in the lives of the people who lived in these shacks. I moved to Mexico City in 1990, and I began to get to know and understand Mexico. By then I spoke Spanish. And the books that I've written until this new one are all mostly about Mexico City. I was able to talk to the people around me in Mexico City, mostly people who don't have a written forum to describe their lives. Dance hall hostesses and shoeshine men, women who pump gas at Pemex stations, these guys who sold Nazi paraphernalia in the Lagunilla flea market. And I was curious about them. I wanted to know what their lives were like, so I was able to talk to them and write down some of their stories, and that's a lot of my previous work. But as Juan said, about 8 or 9 years ago, I began to work as a mitigation investigator, doing exhaustive life histories for defense lawyers who are defending undocumented Mexicans who are facing the death penalty in jails in the United States. In this way, I have finally been able to go into those shacks in ranchos, pueblos, deserted cities, in some pretty dodgy places in Mexico. I've done investigations in Ciudad Juarez, in Tierra Caliente, in Michoacan, in Durango, and some places that are much safer than that, but perhaps just as barren on a cultural level. And also, I've gotten to know the families of the people who are undocumented in the United States, how they survive in the United States against enormous obstacles, living on the fringes and outskirts of towns and cities in all the states that I've worked in, Texas, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Virginia, I'm sure I'm forgetting a few states. And it has been enormously eye-opening to me. As Juan said, some of these very people have become the object of enormous polemic in this election cycle, but none of it has been actually with any attempt to tell their stories. I have been to entire towns, I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that if all of these undocumented Mexicans were to disappear from them, there would be no one to cook a meal in a restaurant, no one to make a bed in a hotel, no one to trim a garden or prune a tree. These cities would stop, would not work anymore, would not function. So I see an enormous political hypocrisy in the politicians who speak against these people. Now, I'm going to read a very brief passage from the novel, which explains a little bit of what I do. The protagonist, or one of the two protagonists, Richard, he has the job I have. He's a mitigation investigator. And he's trying to find out about the life of a woman named Esperanza, who is in jail in Louisiana, accused of murdering her baby. And this is what happens when he gets to the house of her eldest brother. "I'm working for the lawyers who are defending your sister," I said when he came to the door. "May I come in?" Joaquin, Esperanza's eldest brother, opened up without a word. He was a little taller than me, an inch or two over 6 feet, and lanky. At 53, his thick wavy hair was more salt than pepper, but his heavy eyebrows were black. The flesh in his face was beginning to fall. He could have packed for the weekend in the bags under his eyes. I found his house on foot, about 10 unpaved blocks from the market. I walked into the living room. There was a modest table and 4 chairs, a sagging sofa, a framed image of the Virgin of Guadalupe. A boy of about 3 or 4 with a bowl-shaped haircut stood in the doorway to the kitchen. Joaquin's son? His grandson? Beyond the boy, a somber, heavy-set woman dried her hands on a dish towel. She stared at me with impassive, almond-shaped eyes. "Could we please speak privately?" With the kind of cushions that began to slump before they got home from the store. Still, by the standards of a town like Puro Aire, Joaquin was doing well. We got to the last room. Through a screen door, I glimpsed an overgrown patio, a deflated soccer ball, a tricycle on its side as if it were napping. "Take a seat, licenciado," he said, pointing to a sofa covered with an old blanket. He sat in a wooden chair, his hands on his knees. During my investigations, Mexicans called me licenciado all the time. At first, I tried to disabuse them of that notion, insisting that I wasn't a lawyer, merely an investigator who worked for lawyers. Yet even after the explanations, they kept calling me licenciado. Finally, I realized they wanted to believe I was a lawyer. Who was I to spoil their illusion? He wore a checked shirt with snaps for buttons, untucked and with the sleeves rolled up, jeans and snakeskin boots. "This is a nice house," I said. "Thank you." He'd hardly uttered a sound. I hoped small talk might warm him up. "What do you do in Puro Aire?" He let the question sink in before he answered. "What do I do?" "Nothing. I sit around the house." "Okay," I smiled. "Nice work if you can get it." His gaze was penetrating. "This house comes from Montgomery, Alabama," he said, "where I washed dishes and cooked at Marcelo's Italian restaurant. This house comes from Millersville, North Carolina, where I picked tobacco, and Tar Heel, where I worked 12-hour shifts killing pigs in a slaughterhouse. This house comes from planting and picking cotton in Mississippi, sorghum in Missouri, and corn in Kansas. I was a cabinet maker in Iowa. I built doors and bookshelves. I worked for Fleet Line in Nebraska, moving houses with trailers. He made the speech in a flat monotone. This house is 20 years of my life, away from my family in El Gabacho. This house, I understand, I said, and took a deep breath. Look, Joaquin, I am what is called in English a mitigation specialist. There's no reason for you to know what that is because you come from a civilized country where there is no death penalty. Those bags under his eyes and the lines around them made him seem exhausted or ineffably sad. You know that the prosecutor's office in Louisiana is seeking the death penalty for Esperanza? I asked. He said nothing. But there was a slight intake of breath that assured me he'd had no idea. My job is to put a human face on Esperanza. I put together the story of her life and her family. Whenever the prosecutor arrests someone in the US, he makes up a story that he has captured a monster. Hitler, Jack the Ripper, and Hannibal Lecter rolled into one. I tried to show him that Esperanza is a human being who may have made mistakes, but who nevertheless deserves mercy and consideration. I tried to help to convince him to take the death penalty off the table. I paused to see if Joaquin had any questions. If that doesn't work, and in the worst of cases there's a trial and she's found guilty, we tell the story to the jury to convince them that Esperanza's life is worth saving. Do you understand? After a moment, he nodded. It's a terrible lot of information to absorb in a couple of minutes, particularly when it pertains to someone you love. I'm not trying to get them to understand the gringo justice system. I'm just trying to get them to trust me. All I ask is that you tell me the truth, Joaquin. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Todo se vale, okay? Once again, he nodded. I'm going to ask you to go back to the days when you were a little boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old. Tell me about Puro Aire back then. What was it like here? He looked at me, then up at the ceiling, and then back at me. He inhaled deeply through his nose. Putting the palms of his huge hands together, he brought his fingertips to his mouth. He tried to say something, but there were no words. Tears came to his eyes. It was hard, man, he said finally, his voice cracking. It was hard. In my heart, I thanked him 1,000 times. He had conjured a memory from before I was born. More than 45 years later, it still broke his heart. Now we were getting somewhere. I just want to say that on Thursday at 7 o'clock, I'm going to be reading at the Strand bookstore downtown, a different chapter. So if you follow me for a long enough time, you'll hear the whole book without having to read it yourself. Thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, David, for the wonderful presentation and reading. We want to open the floor to questions, so feel free to ask. I mean, if you raise your hand. Yes, please.
I have a question for Nadiah. I know that you only showed us a few images today, but it seemed like there was an emphasis on both youth and then on women in the portraits. And I'm wondering if, first of all, if that's something you've noticed in general, or if that's just a result of the images you picked today. And then, if so, why? Or why do you think this is? Especially given that the rhetoric on migration is so much focused on masculine experience and even up to bad hombres and that kind of rhetoric. So,
Yeah.
I was wondering.
Yeah, thank you for that observation. I hadn't really noticed that, but it makes sense because in like the history of migration from Mexico to the United States, which kind of I mentioned the Bracero program in the 40s, from the 40s to the 60s, which was very much about working men kind of coming, and then since then it's become more of a family kind of families of migrants start to become more the protagonist of these documentary photographers and start to become caught up in the detention centers and the patrolmen's kind of like rounds. And so the photographers that I have chosen to look at, you know, they look at every aspect of migrants' journeys, and so families plays a really big part in that. So yeah, that's something that I hadn't really noticed, but is absolutely a part of the narrative.
Maybe we should ask those who are asking the question to identify. I apologize for not having done with you. Do you want to tell us?
Sure, I'm Maya Dash. I'm a fellow Ph.D. candidate in art history, and I work on Mexico as well.
Thank you very much. Yes.
David, at one point, the image you give us of the border is contact, right? In the U.S. and Mexican people,
Contact or lack of it.
or lack of it. And that can be at the border or elsewhere. And you lived in Mexico for how long?
I have lived in Mexico City since 1990.
More or less continuously.
Yeah, well, there was a period of death and illness in my family that I had to come back to New York for a while, but I've been in Mexico almost that whole time.
I've been to Mexico several times way back in time, and I have all kinds of experiences, but I wonder, from your perspective, what is the range of gringos, Americans, their interest in their vision, how they frame Mexico for all those years? In this new definition or of border, which is contact, right?
Well, it seems to me that the perception of Mexico among people from the United States falls into two general camps. And I'm speaking on very broad terms. There's the romantic element typified by, say, writers like John Reed or Jack Kerouac in the section of On the Road that takes place in Mexico, where they look at Mexicans as these, you know, marvelous, innocent lambs and does with big brown eyes, and you know that there's that cliche, and then there's the other cliche, typified, you know, in literature by Graham Greene or D.H. Lawrence, but now by Donald Trump and all his followers, that, you know, Mexicans are these evil, barbaric animals that are somehow less human than people who were born in the United States. This, parenthetically, is something that frightens me a lot, and I think it may perhaps have gotten worse in recent years. I mean, long before Trump announced his candidacy, I started doing this work, and one of the first things I do when I begin an investigation is read the local newspaper reports online. And so usually it's a cut and dry newspaper story influenced by the police reports. So they just tell you that a murder's happened, but then you read the readers' comments, the people who type in their, and these are the most vituperative, violent, vitriolic things against Mexicans. I have a chapter in the book which is a newspaper report and the readers' comments. And I promise you, I only tweaked them. I took them right off of the internet, and I just tweaked a word here and a word there to play with the language, but they're almost verbatim what horrible things that people say in Mexico. I mean, it's quite horrifying, at least to me. And if I may add, I know this man wants to say something, I'm sorry, but there was an article recently, it was published on the Atlantic Monthly website. I'm not sure if it's actually in the magazine, but it's about the Mexican Capital Legal Assistance Program, which is funded by Mexico's Foreign Ministry to help pay for a defense for Mexicans who are facing the death penalty. And the readers' reports, the readers' comments were just as bad. I would have thought the Atlantic has like a more enlightened readership, but the comments were just as bad as in like some small town Alabama newspaper. It was quite shocking to me. So I wonder if things haven't gotten worse. This man, what
Yes, I think you're making also the same mistake, that you're also stereotyping the views and the objections that most Americans have against the immigration system, which hurts both the American laborer and the Mexican laborer, because the majority of the immigrants, they came here because they were disenfranchised in their own native lands. So I don't know whose game are we playing here. I mean, obviously there were corporations that benefited from that game, and I think that's the message that Trump sent. I don't know where did he get that he's vilifying Mexicans, but definitely he's vilifying the slave traders, the exploiters, the land grabbers, and the drug traffickers. And I think on that side, we should side with him against the people that pretend that they endorse open borders, but they keep their doors in their own homes closed, and they live in their gated communities. There, it's okay for them to have enclosed borders, right? And then they come to the public and say, oh, we should open the borders, and basically push harder the workers and the middle class of both sides of the borders. You see? So I think that the narrative, even though the main media want to make it, to put an artificial wedge between the people that are hurt by that unfair system, I think the message is a message of solidarity, because as you substantiated, even the undocumented immigrants have been integrated by their fellow Americans de facto, maybe not de jure, but de facto they have been integrated. They have been given jobs, and they have been given, integrated. And I've lived in the Midwest. I've lived in many different parts in the United States, and you can see there was a continuum. There was not like ghetto and segregation and things like that. And the last comment I was going to make is that, which will emphasize the exploitation of the worker point, which is, I think, one of the most salient ones, is that today we have the same, economically speaking, we have the same system of slavery, with the only difference now that the slaves are not forced to stay in the places. The example of the woman, you said that I use them, and now they stay in my land. They want to stay in the land. It's so absurd that they want to stay in the land that they have been enslaved. But no, she wants to kick them out. I'm just pointing out these absurdities because we have to think about them more critically than the superficial way that we have been thinking them, especially in this electoral campaign.
David, do you want to reply? I'm a little bit concerned about the whole discussion becoming a discussion about politics, but about current politics.
I think some of your points are well taken, particularly a system of mutual exploitation and how I would say all sides of the American political system have seemed quite happy with having this huge army of undocumented workers doing all sorts of jobs. I mean, I'm not sure how you would, I may have misunderstood you, but if you're defending a man who's referred to Mexicans as rapists and criminals.
To them as such, but it's true that criminal elements and drug trafficking does go through. He didn't say that everybody is. I mean, he's employing them. He didn't have room for decades employing Mexicans.
Okay, I think we need, David, if you want to say something, let's move on.
Fine.
Because we need to move, we need to move on. Somebody, yes, please.
We are fighting against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I'm sorry, but I can't avoid the current politics. I won't, not the presidential election. The NAFTA.
Yes.
All right, go back to NAFTA about immigration. How much are the Mexicans aware of the international agreements that have repercussions in work in Mexico? did they, we know that the Zapatista movement grew out of that. And so I'm really interested in now, is there a dialogue about the Trans-Pacific Partnership in Mexico? Are they, on what level is the whole international trade scene seen by Mexicans on different levels of sophistication as something that impacts on immigration?
That's a really good question, but it's obviously very complicated because there's about 120 million Mexicans.
Anywhere you...
NAFTA has created a lot of jobs in Mexico. The problem is that most of them are very poorly paying jobs, and there's an exploitation of workers. Like, for example, Walmart is the largest private employer in Mexico. But people who work for Walmart have the same problems working for Walmart there that they have here. Their hours are changed, without any warning. They don't have great benefits. This I found out about when I did my research for the Mexico City book. They've had pregnant women having to lift heavy boxes and all sorts of terrible things that Walmart does around the world. But I think that most Mexicans are too concerned with just survival from day to day, or at best month to month, to be thinking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. With all respect, yes, you've got like academics and perhaps some politicians thinking about it, but it's not a part of the daily discourse in Mexico.
You're not aware of the impacts of things that happen on such an international level?
There's also okay, so there's a lot of poor people in Mexico. I know I'm not surprising you by telling you that. Walmart has opened up these really cheap stores that sell really cheap merchandise in a lot of little towns in Mexico. And I don't want to disillusion you, but a lot of the customers are really happy to be able to buy all this stuff that they never realized they needed before they opened the store. And that they used to go to small stores where the merchandise was much more expensive because they're not, globalized. It's not a globalized system of sales and merchandise. Now, I'm looking at your face, and I know what you're thinking.
Immigration, is there any relationship between these and immigration in your mind and in the dialogue?
Well, you know that there are fewer Mexicans immigrating to Mexico than in many, many years. Partly, it is because of heightened border patrols, more violence encountered along the way. But part of it is because there are a few more jobs in Mexico thanks to the free trade agreement. I hate to put it that way because I ideologically share your
Panic.
point of view. But the thing is, if I were an unemployed Mexican and suddenly I got a job, I might be lulled into a belief that these trade agreements are good things.
Thank you.
Yes.
I think I differ a little bit here because I've been in New York since '81, so I've seen the whole migration.
Yeah.
When
What's your
I was
name?
Here, Rosa Maria de la Torre. There was no Mexican community here.
Right. That's right.
And I've seen the whole migration from '85 after the earthquake, and then '94 after NAFTA. So of course it is a big impact on migration. NAFTA and those type of policies definitely are. There was no community here when I came.
Yeah.
Now you don't go anywhere. You go to Chinatown, the workers are Mexican.
Right.
And Chinese are also very close society. But
Yes.
the workers there are Mexican.
Yes.
So it's a big impact. And there's also a lot of indigenous people in New York that you would have never even dreamt that indigenous people from Mexico would be in New York City. Speaking indigenous language, they don't even speak Spanish, some of them. I did a lot of wage theft cases, And
A lot of what cases?
Wage theft cases.
Oh, yeah.
Because they're super exploited. They're the
Right.
most exploited working force here.
Yeah.
So 'cause I work directly with those workers.
I grew up in this city, and I totally share your that narrative of there being no Mexican or virtually no Mexican presence when I was growing up in this city, to an enormous swarm. However, those numbers are not false. In the last, since the economic crisis of 2008, and increased border patrols, more violence on the border, etc., and a slightly better economic situation in Mexico, there has been less immigration to anywhere in the United States.
Well, the other thing is that the migration over here is a different migration. It's from central south to south.
Right.
So it's
right.
totally, I work a lot with young people.
Sure.
And there's a Raza group in Brooklyn. I said, what do you mean by Raza? Because I'm from, respect. So where do you get Raza? He said, I don't know, we're trying to define it. But because it's a totally different migration. I don't know where this is going to go in the next 20 years.
It's a good question.
Yes, please. And can you identify yourself?
My name is Abigail Latin Dardashti. I'm also in the art history program. Sadly, I missed your talk, so I apologize. But I'm luckily familiar with Nadiah's work, and I think her study actually contextualizes the whole contemporary discussion that we're having. So I was wondering if she could tell us a little bit more about how she came to this topic and how it actually informs really these interdisciplinary conversations.
Thanks, Abigail. And I think it does have a lot of relevance. Like, I focus a little bit today, I'm more on the 80s, but in particular, my research is positioned before NAFTA, before this moment when things kind of got out of control in terms of migration rising to exponential levels across the US-Mexico border, and the militarization of the border becoming something that has received far more funding. Really, 1978 was this moment when it started to turn towards getting more and more funding. Like some of the images I showed where they were able to have helicopters, these like small airplanes, these like enhanced surveillance techniques, these like computer monitors that were able to monitor, every section of the border. And this was something that has taken on massive proportions at this point in time, and still threatens to become much worse, and with kind of Donald Trump's allegations that he's going to build a wall. And that kind of reminds me, there's this book that I was reading recently about the history of the US Border Patrol called Migra, and there's this history that they draw from the beginning of the Border Patrol from 1924. And at the time that migrants were starting to come into the border in the 20s, this was after the Mexican Revolution, and Mexico didn't want people leaving their country. They kind of wanted, it was in their best interest, and in fact, south of the border there's also Border Patrol, not many people know that, and they wanted their workers to stay in Mexico to help build this revolutionized country. And so there's this kind of very prescient quote by this Mexican politician who says, "If only we could build a wall to keep them all in." And this is like from 1925, so it's come full circle at this point in time. No, we want to build this wall.
Can I ask Nadiah a question?
Sure.
Nadiah, I don't know if this is an area of your research, but if it is, I'm really curious about this. With the crackdown and the greater increase in Border Patrol agents and the walls that do exist already, has it become more difficult for photographers to document what's going on? I mean, did they stop them or?
Yeah, that's a good question. In fact, part of the reason that I focus a little bit more on this time period in the 80s is because, like I said, there's a rise in photographers, but it's kind of blown up beyond proportion. Like with the advent of digital photography, anybody can go to the border and take pictures, which is great because we have an influx of information on what exactly is going on. There's advocacy groups on the border now who are like leaving water and food out for migrants who are crossing certain areas of the desert. And I just saw an article in the New York Times where there's this photographer who's documenting the border, who's I think part of, I almost want to say he's a magnum photographer, but he's like putting out these really big, beautiful, colorful digital images that document what it looks like now. So in fact, I think it is proliferated. And there's many films on it now and news reports, and it's great because we get stories from all sides of, you know, the narrative. We get them kind of from people who may have more of a conservative bent in documenting it, and people also who have maybe a little more.
But I guess what I wondered is if there are Border Patrol agents or other authorities trying to stop people from taking photographs.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. I can't imagine that they would be so open about it, but even when Susan Meiselas was on the border in 1989, they were pretty open about giving her full access, you know, like they sent her press releases, they sent her like a lot of information. I think they wanted to shape how she experienced it, but I think they'd rather be helping you and trying to, you know,
control
the narrative than to like push you out. It's just my impression.
Nadia, don't assume that we want a wall. Don't say we want the wall. Make it clear who it is who wants the wall.
Excuse me, I oversimplified.
You know, one of the reasons why many young Mexicans wanted to come to the U.S. in the early 90s and late 80s, and perhaps even earlier, was the earliest stages of the demographic transition in Mexico. Meaning, I remember reading the statistics at some point there were 800,000 young Mexicans without jobs in Mexico. And I think that's when coincides with the NAFTA negotiations and the changed relations between the U.S. and Mexico. I think that has to be factor into this discussion of immigration. But I think my question in that context is, what are the perceptions of Mexicans and the ones who migrate, and in terms of border dynamics and the broader border dynamics of the U.S.?
I'm not sure.
What are the, when we discuss the perceptions of the U.S.
So what do the Mexicans think about?
How do the Mexicans think of, especially the ones who migrate, of the U.S. and migrating?
What's the view from the
Yeah.
I think you can both comment from an artistic and.
Well,
part of my question is that at some point, the perception of Mexicans of the U.S. changes. I remember when Mexico was very nationalist.
Yeah.
Right? And then at some point, I went to Mexico. I remember someone saying, "Nosotros los norteamericanos." Mexicans were very proud of nosotros los norteamericanos, right?
Yeah.
So this is a very complex area.
I mean, the populations that I deal with in Mexico and my investigative work, nearly all of them have someone here. So it's considered a normal thing, and even a normal thing for them to spend years and years away, because it used to be a much more fluid border, as you know. It was easier for them to come and go, but now it's become much harder to do that. So it's sadly become a normal part of existence for a family member to be away for even decades. But you know, I think it's just considered a reality that I mean, some of my families, literally, if they didn't have somebody sending them a little something every month from the United States, I don't know how they would have survived.
Remittances.
Yes.
So that's part of the dynamic.
Yes.
It's an economic colonization.
Sorry?
an economic colonization.
Right, right.
They don't have to take the land anymore. They only took the land they want.
That's
I think
right.
from the standpoint of images and identities,
Yeah.
formed through images, what do you see in terms of this perception of the U.S.?
Yeah, just speaking kind of anecdotally, based on a conversation I had with another artist whose images I didn't get to show today, but her name is Lourdes Grobet. And she did this series on Tijuana, and she was there late 80s, early 90s. And they did this series. She actually did this with Nestor Canclini, where they sort of created this laboratory where they took in Tijuana residents and asked them to identify, you know, what are the most iconic elements of Tijuana. They took pictures, they like showed them pictures. It was this whole kind of collaborative group project. And many of the stories that she was telling me was that many of these Mexicans kind of ended up coming to Tijuana, talking a big game about going crossing into the United States to just get work, as if it were such a casual or even a desirable mode of making a living. And they come against the reality when you get to Tijuana that it's not quite so hard, or it's not quite so easy. It actually is quite difficult to get across the border without putting your life in serious danger. And so she talks about these migrants who end up spending weeks, months, turns into years in Tijuana, kind of waiting for these opportunities to cross over to either join family or to go venture out for work. So I think if you're of a certain status or class level where it's a necessity, it's quite desirable to kind of cross the border and, you know, take advantage of whatever monetary gains you can on the other side.
I have a question for David. Why did you choose to write a novel rather than a nonfiction work?
Well, there are two reasons. One, I can't write a nonfiction work about this job because I'm part of the defense team and the information I have falls under attorney-client privilege. But also the other reason, I was kind of thrilled because I became a writer because I wanted to write fiction. And but then I became a reporter, and you know, I was suddenly found a way to earn a living as a writing, and that was a thrill. But you know, I have written fiction before. My first book is a book of short stories, and I was very delighted to sort of have to write this as fiction or not write about it at all. But those are the two reasons.
Any other question?
You sketch an image of Americans into two groups before. When I started going to Mexico, people were motivated by Diego Rivera art, Mexican culture, Mexican people's crafts, and the ancient civilizations and what have you. Those are the people that I met on the road. And then we had Americans moving into San Miguel Allende, another communities. I mean, how, once you factor, are those actors silent in this other question?
Are those what?
Actors silent in this, in the new context of U.S.-Mexico relations?
Well,
These are people who love Mexico, who when the Bildner Center was founded by Albert Bildner, who went to Mexico in the 1930s, 1937, met Diego Rivera and others, and loved Mexico. And that was his deep motivation for promoting the study of Mexican society and visiting and contact.
one thing that I do feel is different, definitely, since 2008 and the economic crisis, international, I see more and more Americans, South Americans, and Europeans in Mexico City, because the economies are kind of stuck in a lot of places where they're from. And I see more and more of them coming to Mexico City trying to try their luck. And many of them are young. I mean, they all know who Diego Rivera is, but he's just this sort of point of cultural reference that is not that important to them.
Sitting in the back.
Yeah. I mean, and yeah, everybody who goes there wants to go to Frida's house when they get there. But it's like, I'm not so sure how much a current part of the cultural reference those, like San Miguel de Allende. I haven't been there in years, so I can't really tell you what's going on there now, but my understanding from a friend who lives there is that a lot of that generation that you're speaking of Americans who went there, they're gone or they're not feeling very well. I mean, they're quite, and that it's a younger population, like people, middle-aged people, my age, or who are moving to San Miguel de Allende. I don't really know. And yes, every one of those people is going to know who Frida Kahlo is and who Diego Rivera is, but I'm not so sure. I mean, there are like other Mexican painters who've come along and conceptual artists and photographers who've come along since then and who might be a little bit more vividly part of the discourse among some of the, certainly the arts-oriented people.
Can you name three?
Yeah, Yoshua Ocon, Miguel Calderon, and who? Oh, yeah. Orozco, Gabriela Orozco. There's a woman who does, do you remember the name of the woman who does like those, she would go into the morgues in Mexico City and...
Semefo.
Yeah, do you know? I'm
Teresa Margolles.
Thank you. Teresa Margolles, Daniela Rosell. There was a big movement in the late 80s, early 90s of some young Mexican artists and some foreign artists living in Mexico who made a lot of noise on an international scale. Gabriela Orozco had a one-man show or one-person show at the Museum of Modern Art here in New York just a couple of years ago. I mean, these people did make a lot of noise.
David, the new context in the U.S., are you optimistic or pessimistic about...
Oh, I'm trying to be optimistic, but it's pretty hard these days.
The future of U.S.-Mexico relations.
It's hard to be optimistic. I don't know if you share that. I'm trying, but it's pretty hard. I don't, I've lived, just in the years that I have lived in Mexico City, I've lived through 4 presidents who promised to change the immigration rules and to make things more positive for Mexicans, and none of that has happened. And I just have a hard time.
From your perspective, what should happen? Yes.
Okay, number one, legalize drugs on both sides of the border. You will not have people murdering each other over them once drugs are legal. You make it a state industry, and those gangsters have to go get some other job, 2, I would do an amnesty program certainly for the kids who were born here, and I would say for most of their parents. I can understand if you've been convicted of a serious crime that you don't get amnesty. But if all you've done is like gone through a red light or a stop sign, that is ridiculous to treat you as if you were a murderer. The criminal justice system, I can tell you firsthand, is not equitable if you are Latino. If you don't speak, if you're not a native-born speaker, if you have brown skin, you are not treated the same way in the U.S. criminal justice system as if you were born here as a white person. And it's even worse if you're a black person, I think. But those are the 2 things I would start with: legalization of drugs and amnesty for the people who've been here for a long time. I don't know if you have any things that you would add to that, Nadia, but...
Yeah, I would second that. I think those are reasonable.
And then from there, there's like a lot more to be done, but that's at least where I'd begin.
So is there any possible expectation? Is there a movement in Mexico that's making these demands of people they know? Is the Mexican-American community making these demands? I know the last Organization of American States, they all said end the drug war, end the war on drugs, right? Is that something that there's discussion of? It seems like Mexico is almost a failed state now with the...
It's certain parts, certain areas in Mexico I would classify, not the whole country, but certain areas like Tamaulipas, for example. But what you're saying, okay, on the one hand, Mexico, small amounts of drugs, if you have them for your personal use, are legal. But on the other hand, there are so many politicians, soldiers, police who are making money out of that. Yeah, that I don't have a lot of faith that anyone in power really wants to
legalize, because they're making too much money off it. The authorities.
Maybe in recent modern discussions of the border, as I recall, when I've been following them, focused on maquilas.
Yeah.
The border, to refer to the border was maquilas, and often now you could be critical or supportive with maquilas. That's gone too?
No, the maquilas are still
there.
There's many of, I mean, my understanding is that some of them have closed down, but that a lot of them are still there, not just on the border, but in Querétaro and in many states.
Inside the lower. No?
Yeah, Aguascalientes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know if you want to say something about this, but.
Yeah, no, just that they're all still there and that they're south of the border, and that actually the reason that they started the maquilas was after this Bracero program, when they had all of these unemployed Mexicans kind of along the border needing work, and this really genius idea they had is, let's employ their daughters and their wives. So this huge labor force of women was actually tapped for the maquilas, at least initially. I don't know if that's
still true. And as my friend, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Yanis, if you want to see a system of worker exploitation, of virtual slavery, all you got to do is go to a maquila. One of the chapters in my book, but the part of the progress of the story of the woman who ends up in jail in Louisiana is she goes to Ciudad Juarez to work in a maquila. And I saw this with my own eyes when I had a case in Ciudad Juarez. Those are not nice places to work. Let me just put it that way. You work very, very long hours for very, very little money. And, I wouldn't go so far as to call it slavery because, slaves didn't get paid anything. But these people are working under very difficult conditions.
Oh, whatever happened to the lady in your story?
Esmeralda, what happens to her?
No, you have to read the book.
Yeah, of course.
It's not the real story, right?
Sorry?
But it's fiction, the novel.
The novel?
The real story. I'm being facetious because you said it's fictionalized.
Oh yeah, no. I had a case in Ciudad Juarez, but it had nothing to do with. I mean, this really is fiction. It's not. In my case in Ciudad Juarez, that was the best outcome I've had. I mean, it would take a long time, but this guy got out of jail after a relatively short time. But he wasn't. I mean, he was guilty of guarding the door while some people were trying to get money back from a botched drug deal. Some people stole some drug money. He was just guarding the door with a pistol. And then they didn't get their money, so they all left. And a week later, somebody killed all these people, not my guy. So, but under the laws of complicity in Alabama, he could have got the death penalty, which to me is outrageous. But he didn't. He got out of jail just after a few years.
What attorney do you work with?
I work for different attorneys. I get hired on a case-by-case basis. If they suddenly have this client that they can't speak to because they don't speak Spanish.
I worked for a very famous criminal defense attorney for 10 years. For Bill Kunzler in his office. the last 10 years of his life.
Wow, wow. No, he was a really important
He's a very
lawyer.
special person.
Yeah, totally. I never met him, but I know very well who he was, yeah.
Well, I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank David and Nadia for their wonderful presentation.